You're now live, Chair.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this evening's meeting of the Climate Change Working Group. I'm Councillor Anthony McEwen, Leader of the Council and Chair of the Working Group. I'd like to inform everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet via the Council's website and will be capable of repeat viewings. The images and sound recordings may also be used for training purposes within the Council. In order to ensure that the meeting is managed effectively, can everyone please keep to the following guidelines to speaking? Councillors should only use the raise your hand function to request to speak and only speak when invited to do so by the chair. Please switch off your cameras and microphone when not speaking, and remember to set your mobile phone to silent for the duration of the meeting. Please note, any views expressed by any speaker in this meeting are the speaker's own and they do not necessarily reflect the views of the Council. Please can councillors be aware that the webcast will continue to be streamed live 20 seconds after the close of the meeting. This is due to a time delay in transmitting live. I will now confirm the remaining members of the committee. Councillor Pauline Bell, Angela Benham, Jenny Benzer, Joanne Collins, Joanna Collins, Dom Elliott Starkey, Simon Evans, Linda Gruby, Madeline Hall, Ian Huddleston, Pete Inman, Pam Reddy, Jill Scott and Jean Todd. We'll move on to the agenda now, starting with agenda item 1. And apologies for absence, and I have apologies from Pete Inman, and Jenny Benz is going to be about 15 minutes late. Are there any other apologies? Nope. Move on then to agenda item 2. Any declarations of interest on matters before the group this evening? Any disclosable pecuniary interests or any other interests? Move on then to the minutes of our last gathering. I'll just quickly go through them page by page for any comments around accuracy. Is there anything page 3, 4 and 5? No, are we okay that they reflect our last gathering?
Yeah, I'll propose that, Chair.
Yes.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Jean. Move on again then to agenda item 4, introducing our new biodiversity officer, Katie Hampton. I don't know whether Dave wants to do the introduction or if Katie's doing the introduction herself.
Well, she's appeared as if by magic. So we're very pleased to welcome Katie to the organisation. She's been here 1 week and 1 day. She's still with us, so that's a bonus. And she's still smiling and enthusiastic. Hoping her enthusiasm rubs off on us all and lasts as well. So, Katie, do you want to say hello to our members?
Hello, yeah, I'm a new biodiversity officer. As David said, I started last week. So we're going to be looking after all things sort of nature recovery and biodiversity moving forwards across the Alliance. And yeah, looking forward to getting involved with the climate change and biodiversity working groups too. So good to meet everyone.
Thanks, Katie. The only other thing to say, Anthony, is that we will be setting up meetings so that Katie can come out and see people and get to know both the individuals and the area. So we'll be back in touch over that. If anybody has any particular sites or things of interest they want to include on Katie's roadshow, just drop her a line and yeah, we'll set something up. Thanks, Anthony.
That's great to hear, and it's good that you come back after the first week, so that's always a promising start. We've not scared you off after the first week, so that's definitely a good thing.
Thanks, Anthony.
Okie doke. We shall move on again then to agenda item 5. We've got Holly Fisher from Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. For those members that are longer in the tooth, you will recall, hopefully, that we tasked Derbyshire Wildlife Trust with doing some work for us around drawing up the plan for nature. We're now in a position where they're able to present this work back to us. So I'll hand over to Holly.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I've just got a presentation that I'll run through that sort of gives a sort of highlight overview of what the report entails. Great. Okay. So I'm the Nature Recovery Advice Manager at the Wild Solutions team within Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. And I've been sort of leading on the delivery of this Plan for Nature within the High Peak Borough Council. Yeah. So to provide sort of a bit of background about the report and the sort of wider piece of work, the real goal of it is to form the basis of a formal biodiversity strategy, which can then be implemented following the release of the County Council's local nature recovery strategy, and sort of try and give it that much more locally focused, appropriate for the High Peak angle. It is sort of, the aim is to provide a roadmap for nature's recovery. So really trying to make sure that kind of nature is really integrated within policies, plans, projects, and trying to take a much more sort of dynamic, adaptable approach. And really as well focusing on compliance with upcoming and existing policies and legislations that impact the council. So there is a focus on this around biodiversity net gain, and particularly sort of the use of council owned land within potentially sort of biodiversity net gain as a habitat bank, but also compliance with the statutory biodiversity duty, which comes in for local authorities in January, which is where you sort of have to evidence what you currently have for nature, what opportunities you've got, and how you're going to reach those. So it's based on those Lawton principles of sort of bigger, better, more, and joined up wild spaces, to try and create nature recovery networks through the borough using planning and policy, and taking a very much like data and evidence led approach, and using sort of spatial data to outline how we can get there. So the report is very big, covers quite a lot of different aspects, but the kind of overall headlines are a desk-based assessment of the current state of nature for the borough, so where we are currently at, what the existing gaps and barriers are for species dispersal, and we sort of use key representative species for 3 main habitat types, which is open, wetland, and woodland. So this is kind of looking at where those real barriers are within the landscape at the moment. Providing sort of spatial data for where the priority areas for the creation of these new habitats are to create these connected corridors. Updated targets for habitat and species expansion. An overview of key opportunities and proposed actions to actually achieve these things. There's a feasibility assessment of 15 council-owned lands for BNG, and then sort of guidance documents on the creation and management of appropriate habitats sort of within the landscape. So I'll try and just sort of give an overview of some of the headlines really that came out of the report. So the initial bit is that baseline biodiversity assessment. Where are we at now? And one of the big goals that we're sort of pushing for is that aim of 30% of the county, so also the borough, to be managed for wildlife by 2030. When we look at sort of designated land within the High Peak Borough, you already have 40% of the land cover that's actually designated at a statutory or non-statutory level. So the premise is sort of, it looks really good at this level, and particularly up in the north, you can see we've got real connected habitats. But when you look further into this and look at sort of the actual condition of these, only 4% of the land covering is actually considered to be in good condition if it's a designated site. So this map to the left here just shows that on with a colour gradient. So the greens are the ones that are currently identified as being favourable, and then the sort of oranges and reds are unfavourable, maintaining and declining. So that is sort of one of the big barriers within site. A big reason for this is a lot of the triple SIs that are within the north of the borough, with almost all of the triple SI units within the Peak District currently in unfavourable condition. But then we've got lots of smaller non-statutory sites, so local wildlife sites within the south that are also kind of really struggling, really in quite poor condition. And there's a multitude of reasons behind this, including sort of funding for smaller projects, support for those landowners, but also the continued push for agriculture, intensifying landscapes, habitat loss, fragmentation, all that sort of stuff. So when we look sort of a bit further into the baseline assessment of what is currently here, this map at the moment, it gives an overview of where the sort of these core habitats for open wetland and woodland species currently are. But it doesn't really show the sort of the condition of them. So again, same as before, in terms of actual cover, there's a huge amount of land within the borough that has the potential to be good for wildlife. But when we actually sort of look into how that is coping at the moment, what status it's in, what its carrying capacity is, it's sort of much more fragmented landscape in reality. The woodland network is currently the most sparse within the borough, which is probably to be expected. So if you just look on the map, those kind of dark green narrow lines, they're where we have recorded existing priority wooded habitat. So we've got some real sort of hotspots of where things are, but largely it's kind of very fragmented, very small scattered sites, which means that there's not much opportunity for species to sort of actually move through and commute. But also there's the possibility that they could sort of be acting as source and sink habitats for species. So this is where we'll have a good population of a species within a large habitat. And then as they sort of grow and they have to disperse further, they're being pushed into these smaller sites. And then the populations are sort of essentially just failing because they don't have the resources there to actually support them. The High Peak Borough has below the UK average for woodland cover, with the sort of most up-to-date figures sitting you at around 8% currently covered with woodland or woodland habitat. The open and wetland sites, as sort of can be expected, huge amount, which a lot of it is that bog and peatland habitat, but also a mixture of different grasslands, got acidic and calcareous, some nice neutral grasslands as well, and presence of sort of some much rarer open habitats as well, of things like limestone heath. So in terms of actual cover, say huge amount, very present, but then it's that condition. So the sort of current estimate of what percentage of the borough as a whole is currently a good value habitat in good condition puts you around 15%, which is a really good starting off point. But sort of, I think, you know, when we look at it from the amount of land that's actually designated at the 40%, as well as looking at the actual distribution here, it sort of really highlights that one of the key focuses to actually achieve nature recovery within the borough has to be enhancing what we've already got, not just looking at creation of new. So the bulk of the work was based on Nature Recovery Network map, which the final output is this map up here, which I recognise sort of at initial glance looks a bit like a very intense, quite scary, complicated blob. But I will break it down a little bit further. And then we've got sort of in the report itself, there's a full breakdown of the methodology in the appendix, and I'm more than happy to have a more in-depth conversation with anybody that is interested about sort of how we actually achieve the outputs for this. And then there's maps and text and stuff that's broken down further in the report as well. But just sort of a bit on the methodology. So it really kind of uses spatial priorities to show that creation and expansion and restoration of key habitats. And the aim is to sort of find paths of least resistance for creating these new networks. It uses a mixture of different computer programs. So this is two main mapping programs of QGIS and ArcGIS, but then it also uses Anaconda Python, which is a coding program to sort of really collate and assess this huge amount of data. The first stage is that we create a aggregated habitat inventory of what is currently here, and sort of, so that's essentially collecting all the habitat data that there is at the moment within the area, reviewing it by its reliability, its age, its sort of coverage over a land parcel, and then creating a final output. And then once we have that list of habitats, it's looking at their suitability and their permeability for those key representative species of open wetland and woodland habitats that I mentioned earlier. So that's looking at sort of what the estimated cost of movement through these different habitats would be for each of these species, and which they would consider sort of their core habitats that they would actually reside in. Integrates a mixture of other different data sets, which is aiming to sort of look at the key ecological and physical factors, and that includes flood risk zones, digital elevation models, soil drainage, and then standard dispersal distances for those generic focal species. And the final output is this. So it really should sort of be approached quite dynamically and not seen as a static standalone piece of work, because ideally, as the existing core networks change, so as we create new habitats or existing habitats sort of expand in their area, those high priority target areas for actually creating new networks and connecting these spaces up should change over time. But so we do sort of, yeah, just take a look at it, not just a static document. And then also just the recognition that the output is only as accurate as the data that we actually put in. So we can't kind of view it as a gospel piece of information, but more just trying to provide that sort of more evidence-based scientific thinking behind what habitats are the most strategically significant to actually create in terms of the wider landscape. So I've just sort of zoomed in here on the woodland one to give it a bit more thought and to make it a bit less busy. So within the woodlands, like I said earlier, the sort of existing network of woodland habitats are, it's the most sparse. And so in terms of proposed outputs, there was a big push behind that to sort of create new spaces, create new woodlands and new wooded habitats, because we need to do so much more to actually connect things up. So with woodlands, the woodland habitat work, it's not just sort of broadleaf woodland that's being proposed, but basically kind of all kinds of wooded habitats. So that would be tree lines, hedgerows, scattered trees, scattered scrub, and yeah, not just sort of thinking about it in that pure block of woodland impact. And that means that there's lots of ways that we can kind of integrate it within the more urban areas. So thinking about street trees and hedgerows and corners of scrub and things within our public open spaces. The outputs of the map showed a real priority for the creation of riparian habitats. So riparian woodlands, wet woodlands, along, yeah, a lot of our sort of existing strongholds, so sort of within Lady Bower and up above Glossop. And then within the open recommendations, as we expected, there was a huge push on expansion of those bog and heathland habitats and re-wetting habitats, creating sort of marshy areas and wet grasslands, and thinking about, yeah, sort of where within those public open spaces and urban areas we can bring in more sites. So like I say, it's kind of a very high level overview, lots more information in the report, and I'm more than happy to, yeah, have a more in-depth conversation with anybody that's got specific questions around the mapping and that data side of the work. a big portion of the report and the work that we were doing was looking at the potential of having sort of habitat banks through council-owned land using biodiversity net gain. So as a council, you own or manage quite a lot of land within the borough, and there's lots of sort of different things within that, whether it's residential areas, parks and gardens, churchyards, amenity spaces. So there's quite a lot of potential of ways that you can directly impact nature recovery just through changes in your own management and changes in sort of land use. So we took a look at that big list of council-owned land and worked with the planning team to narrow down that list to a total of 28 priority sites on your side that could potentially be suitable for the use of BNG. And then we took those and did a desk-based assessment and identified 15 priority sites, which we would then subject to a physical survey. The goals of this is to really we want to look at taking existing poor quality sites that are strategically located and turning them into something better, rather than enhancing good quality habitats to something better. It's like creating new and using BNG as a means to do that. So we carried out 15 surveys and essentially sort of ran through proposed uplifts of what these could be if BNG is suitable for that. And from that, we sort of had 4 that really were really highlighted through that, as that they could be a really good option, which is Hogshaw Recreation Ground in Buxton, Temple Fields in Buxton, Granby Road in Buxton, and land off Woolley Bridge Road in Hadfield. The proposals and things that were within the report as part of this, they are really meant to be kind of indicative as to what the uplift could be, because the majority of these sites are public open spaces and already have community and amenity value. And so really we'd want to have a push on making sure that the community that are within that area are consulted and involved in the final design of what that site looks like, to make sure that it is actually valuable to them and it's not a loss of community space. And then in terms of just sort of the way that habitat banking site works and biodiversity net gain, is that because it's obviously focused around planning and preventing net loss through development, the calculator itself does really favour the creation of sort of safer and easier habitats. And because it's on a like-for-like basis, your sort of the habitats that you're creating through habitat banks are largely driven by demand of what will be lost through development. So there is quite a focus on sort of a lot of neutral grasslands and scrub, because these are the types of things that are typically lost. And then with smaller sites, like what a lot of the council-owned lands are, it does mean that you are sort of restricted a little bit there. So the proposals are nothing super fancy, but hopefully we can still sort of use it as a means to make it financially viable to have really valuable green spaces for not just the community, but also the sort of wildlife within those areas. The final big bit of the document is essentially a proposed action plan of what those key recommendations that we really think are the most strategic, will have the most impact if taken forward. There's much more that the wider document covers, but these are sort of 4 main headers. So it's around planning and development. So we've suggested a push for a minimum of 20% BNG requirement within planning, mandatory inclusion of good quality green and blue infrastructure within new developments, reviewing of allocated sites within the local plan, particularly around brownfield sites that have been allocated for quite a long time, and trying to take a much more sort of dynamic and adaptable approach about where these sites might have now developed on their own through succession, maybe are open mosaic habitat, priority habitat. It's very frequently lost sort of through development of brownfield and urban areas. And also push for the consideration of a wild belt designation, which would be looking at sort of providing a non-statutory designation to those areas that we've identified through the NRN as being really high priority for the creation of habitats, but that they might at present actually be fairly low value. One of the key focuses was around designated sites. So sort of as we spoke about at the start, the level of existing protected sites, protected habitats, actual cover of habitats is really, really good, but it's the condition that these are in. So looking at improving what we already have through increased information around surveying and what is there, looking at sort of funding for some of the smaller sites, because that is one of the big drawbacks, one of the big sort of limitations within non-statutory designations such as local wildlife sites, is that there's sort of not really a huge amount of support there for those smaller landowners to be maintaining these habitats in good condition. Number 3 was around engagement and consultation with key stakeholders, particularly the sort of community, biodiversity groups and those local groups. And for this, we sort of pushed the idea of a biodiversity summit, active collaboration and engagement with these groups, and looking at sort of where key projects that can be taken forward, where can ownership of those be shared with these groups that we're sort of working with. And then number 4 is about this sort of council-owned land. So like I said earlier, you own quite a lot of land. It's really varied and there's lots of different land uses within that. So looking at reviewing the existing management plans of the existing habitats and sites, particularly sort of some of the bigger urban parks, and maybe pushing for a movement away from ornamental green spaces to ones that are sort of really varied, valuable, and provide sort of a wealth of different ecosystem services. Looking at creation of these sort of high-level bespoke management plans of these open spaces, looking at green finance through things like biodiversity banking, and then sort of reviewing current management practices of things like vergers and the way that we are. Sorry, someone just walked through the door. And sort of that active and rolling review of management. So like I said, it's a very sort of whistle-stop tour of a very big piece of work that we've been working on for the past few months, and quite a big document. But if anybody wants to go through any questions at this stage, or for me to go back over any of the points.
Okay, thanks, Holly. We'll just open it up for questions in a second, but we've got one question in the chat already from Pauline, who asks, given much of the uplands in the High Peak is above the tree line, is the low percentage of woodland surprising or of concern?
Well, I think sort of if you look at the map within that, obviously, yes, we're not expecting a huge amount of woodland cover within those areas of sort of the SSSI covered areas and the moorlands, but the actual kind of cover within the lowland areas of the habitat, the lowland areas of the borough, and the areas that are sort of outside of this heathland, they're still really, really sparse. It's really kind of low. The sizes of the sites as well are very small. So I think definitely sort of still an area of concern because that connectivity just isn't really there.
Okay, thanks. I've got Jill first.
Right. Thank you. Trying to get everything switched on. I think this is probably going to be the most important document I'm going to see in the whole 4 years I'm a councillor. That sort of shows my level of interest in the kind of biodiversity, etc. But it's a brilliant document. Thank you. There's lots of different things I'd want to talk about. I'm the councillor for Hayfield, so obviously we've got Kinder Scout, and don't know if it comes in the report. I've kind of read the report and certainly focused on the bits in my ward, but land ownership is a key thing, and access to land, obviously. And much of Kinder is owned by the National Trust, and obviously some of their practices run against what you're trying to do. I'm thinking particularly of grouse shooting, the burning of heather, etc. So you say we can work with community groups, which we can. We've got Sustainable Hayfield who are brilliant, but it's actually those bigger fish, those bigger landowners and organisations like the National Trust who are really key in making kind of like big policy changes. So how do you see us going about that?
Yeah, 100%. And I sort of recognise as well that as a borough, you are in quite a difficult position that such a huge amount of your land is within that national park, that's within those sort of really big ownerships owned by a small number of individuals, which will always be quite a limiting factor then, because obviously you have less control over what can happen and what you can do. But I think definitely sort of there's opportunities for different levels of partnership working between the organisations that are there. So building that relationship, looking at sort of maybe where we do have projects that can overlap and work collaboratively together. But obviously, it is always going to be out of our control as to what the landowners do. But I think continuing with sort of pushing for the movement in that you're doing this level of stuff and trying to sort of set that example, because we still sort of need to be doing what we can within our own ownership and with our own power, whilst I think obviously working on those kind of bigger issues in the background. But the real push for that, I think, definitely is kind of around just partnership working and identifying where we've got shared goals with these people that we could maybe work together with.
Thanks. Can I ask one other question, Anthony, or do you want me to give way?
No, go on.
Yeah, sorry. And the other thing, obviously Hayfield, the Kinder trespass and the right to roam and access to walkers, there does become a conflict between regenerating land and people walking through it and on it. And I don't know, I think that's something certainly in Hayfield will be a very interesting conversation, because we've got Kinder Bank, which is an ancient woodland, and there's lots of kind of different nesting birds, and people want to have a footpath through it, but other people say you're going to damage the environment there. So that would be a very interesting conversation about, yes, of course, it's great for people to have access to nature, and I love that myself, but how far is that always a good thing?
Yeah, and it's definitely sort of a real conflict that we will always have in terms of trying to find that balance, because particularly within the Wildlife Trust, so our sort of strategic goals, obviously one of them is around that 30% of land being managed for nature by 2030, but we've also got strategic goals around the number of people engaged with nature, access, and sort of people acting for nature as well. So it's how you find that balance, and we really do want to make it a priority that sort of we're creating these habitats for the wildlife, but also for the sort of community benefits that they have and the different ecosystem service provision that we get through that. And I think the big way to sort of counter that and reduce the risk is around proper engagement and education with these groups, because having a footpath through a good quality habitat is fine. It's not going to have a massive impact on the things that are using it. It's when people are going off the footpaths and sort of causing damage and disturbance. And so we need to make sure that people feel pride and ownership over these areas that they live, and feel sort of involved in them, and that these spaces actually are they're considering them as well, that they're included within this. So if you've already got a biodiversity group and stuff, and that's a really good place to start, because they'll be so integrated within the community, and working out sort of different ways that you can really involve the rest of the stakeholder groups, particularly ones that might be sort of causing damage because they don't know the impact that it's having, that you know, if it doesn't impact me, then why should I? It's getting them involved and feeling that sort of level of appreciation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jill. Jean?
Oh, yes, thank you, Holly, for this. I've been looking forward to seeing it for quite a while now. I know you've been talking to the planning officers about things, but I was just wondering how much notice you've taken of our existing local plan and the sites that are in it for development, because obviously some of the ones that you've designated as places for improvement are already in our local plan for development.
Yeah, so in terms of the actual review of sort of council owned land, like I say, so we got the sort of full GIS file of what's within the ownership, but then for the specific stage it was actually doing the habitat surveys on them and looking at them for BNG. That's where we sort of worked really closely with the planning team, and so they reduced that down to those 28 that could be changed for the land use. So yeah, within that sort of, we didn't consider anything that would be a no-go from your end in terms of that it's already allocated within the local plan. But yeah, in terms of like the sort of spatial, just general spatial areas of where I've identified as like high priority for creation or restoration of X amount of habitats, we did have a focus on what land you own, because obviously that's where we've got the sort of, you can have direct impact yourself. But within that, it's sort of whether what its current land use is was not considered a reason to not include it, because there's always things that can be done. You know, even if it is, we've identified that this sort of corridor of land is really high priority for woodland corridors, but you've already got that allocated within your local plan as being developed in 5 years, then you know, maybe sort of trying to think about the design of that development and how can we really integrate sort of those key habitats and take that into consideration to find that balance. But yeah, in terms of the actual surveys, we didn't survey any that were already allocated because they would have been removed by Dave.
One thing I noticed with, for instance, with Hogshaw, which is a controversial place, it's got the recreation field there and the playing field. You seem to have included that in the development area, or that is improvement area, I should say. Whereas in a lot of the others, you've not surveyed the recreation areas at all. Yeah,
so if it's existing amenity or the existing sort of recreation ground, we didn't put it within the calculator, because if it's being retained for amenity, then obviously there's nothing that can really happen there.
But that recreation ground, the football field, etc., was protected in the local plan that we had as well. Okay. The other thing, I think it's very interesting to change the green belt into a wild belt. I think that would be very interesting, and I don't know what the planning people have said about that, actually. Wondering. And the carbon credits for the woodland and the peat bog areas, I think that the funding for that, if that could be helping farmers and such like that, I think that would be good.
Yeah, and that's the, you know, there is so many more schemes coming available now to sort of make nature recovery more financially viable for landowners, but it's because it's so new in a lot of these areas, and obviously such a different type of work to what landowners particularly used to doing, it makes it much more complicated to actually achieve that. So yeah, I think really sort of trying to make sure that the information is easily accessible as to what is actually available will be really important moving forward to try and get more landowners on board and sort of see that change in land use.
Well, I think you've put in a lot of suggestions that we can take on board. Thanks very much for that. Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jean. Joanna?
Yes, hello. I thought this was fantastic, actually, really interesting and detailed and useful. I am sort of, I suppose, a bit concerned about the actual influence that Hope Valley, that High Peak has. For example, there's Moors for the Future. I don't know if High Peak's actually a member of the Moors for the Future partnership. Is it? Anthony?
I don't think we are.
Yeah,
we've been involved on the fringes, but we obviously don't own any type of that land directory,
no,
and most of it is within the management of the Peak Park in terms of planning places, etc.
But it is, I mean, thinking about what Gillian was saying about the moorland, you know, I think that's would actually be quite difficult for High Peak to influence particularly. And indeed, the sort of moorland edges where there are farmers who, some of whom I think are really looking at this sort of stuff seriously. I mean, you know, biodiversity net gain and elms and stuff. Some aren't, but still, you know, I think High Peak actually has limited influences in some places, but I think that makes it all the more important that High Peak's own land is seriously managed for, well, nature recovery, biodiversity, and also, of course, in the new local plan that it's properly integrated. Yeah, there was one very niggly thing. I actually couldn't work out whether this was a draft or not. I think the first 2 pages said draft and then draft disappeared.
Yeah, so yes, still a draft because obviously going through sort of this internal consultation and but it's the final draft. Yeah, so it's not published and official, still room for amendment, but the sort of the bulk of the work is done. But yeah, in terms of sort of the land ownership and stuff, I really agree with you there. Like I say earlier, I think sort of within High Peak, you're in quite an interesting position with so much of the borough being within the national park and so much of it being SSSI. But I think it is important to have that sort of overall view of what is within your own borough and within your boundary. And yeah, so where then that means that you can actually push real change. And a lot of that is within that sort of the urban and suburban areas where you do have a lot of influence and land ownership. And yeah, creating sort of those corridors throughout those places that are currently sort of the main barriers for dispersal for a lot of species.
Yeah, and the niggle actually was, I think the Lawton principles are bigger, better and more joined up.
Bigger, better, more and joined up, but happy to be corrected.
Yeah, I did check it actually this morning. That's only a niggle though. I did think it was really good. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Yep, go on.
Anthony, do you mind? I just wondered what next steps were. I don't know if we're going to get onto that at this meeting.
We may be about to get some steer on that shortly. Just, are there any more member questions or comments first? Nope. Go on then, David.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, just in response to Councillor Collins, that the plan is intended to be a plan for the borough rather than the borough council. So in terms of that influence, I think part of that influence is actually producing the plan so that people can see, you know, what's there and what can happen within the borough. So that's the first part of the journey. Then the other bit is around those partnerships that we will be entering into. So without jumping in directly into the next steps, but part of that will be then to look at the governance and how we take this forward and who needs to be around the table and what conversations we have to actually deliver. But I just think we need to make that distinction that it is a plan for the area of High Peak rather than for the Borough Council.
Okay, thanks, David. Gillian?
Hello. I was just to make a point really. This work we did work really. I was involved with Holly and the planners and the commissioning team at looking at all those sites. And what we actually realised is we actually do own a lot of land, but it's actually with our council housing. Obviously, we don't really have influence on that, but that's how we came up with the Wilder High Peak project when we had that summit in New Mills, and Katie, thankfully, is here, so she can start actually taking that on a bit more and doing that engagement stuff. So although it's not big landscape level, you know, working sort of street by street with community groups or whatever, I think that's as important really. So it's that sort of top down. And so yeah, it's just to make that point. We already have had something wonderful come out of this relationship anyway. So that was all.
Okay, thanks, Gillian. Thanks, Holly, for the presentation this evening. It's obviously the start of a process. It sort of fits in at quite a good time because we're in the midst of the local plan review. Similar, our occasional friends at times in the Peak District National Park are also going through their management plan approach, their effective version of the local plan. So I think there may well be some opportunities to try and see how much of this we can try and get matched up. But I suspect it will probably come back to us on quite a few more occasions, and will undoubtedly appear in a couple of different places as we're going through those respective processes elsewhere. But no, thanks for your presentation this evening. And if I can see no further hands or anything, so we can let you escape if you so wish.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. You've done a brilliant job for us. Thank you very much.
Okay, we shall move on then to look at the DCC Verges project with Susan White from DCC.
Hello. Well, thank you all for having me. Just if you could just do a nod, Anthony, if you can hear me, that would be useful. Great, thank you. I'm never convinced my microphone is properly switched on when I do these things, and then I go rabbiting off without anybody listening. This is great. I really enjoyed listening to Holly because I think there are some aspects of this project which may feed very well into some of the plans that she's put forward there. I'll just quickly start by going through the key pieces of work that I've been tasked to do, just to put it into context for anybody that I might not have spoken to about this before, although I think I've spoken to everyone in this group. I was seconded to work on this time-limited project to look at whether there was opportunity and appetite to consider the management of grass verges, highway grass verges differently. So highway grass verges are those that are owned and controlled by the Highways Authority, which in this case is Derbyshire County Council, and that's adopted roads only, so that doesn't include on private lanes and housing estates where perhaps roads haven't been adopted. And the key principles was I was to work closely with 2 district boroughs to investigate the machinery needs, capabilities and costs that would be required to change to a cut and collect system. So as you know, at the moment, the Derbyshire County Council contracts the work to yourselves, delegates the works to yourselves through agency agreements, and that these agency agreements specify that verges must be cut 6 times a year, and we operate on a cut and drop system at the moment. So looking at what would it take to change to a cut and collect system. I was set to investigate the different challenges of urban and rural verge management. Now, I know that there are very few places in the county of Derbyshire that would describe themselves as urban, but in the case of road verge management, urban is any highway that's within the 30-mile-an-hour envelope. So that includes quite a lot of small villages and even hamlets where there is a 30-mile-an-hour limit. And that is because the agency agreements specify a different sort of management between urban verges and rural verges, but both on a cut and drop system. I was to identify the physical, economical, physical, economic, organisational and perceptual barriers to change. identify potential costs and savings within the framework of the agency agreements and what the implications may be over finer local control of verge management. So that's sort of a bit in finance, but also the legal side of what we do with the agency agreements. And also to ensure that the County Council's duties as the Highways Authority are maintained, particularly with reference to access to the highway and safety. And access to the highway includes access to the pavement. So I have to take that into account as well. So if I just go through, probably, I mean, I've become such a highway verge nerd, I could take up the rest of your evening talking about this. So I'm going to try really hard just to skim over a few of the findings that we've got, and then hopefully leave some time for people to ask questions about the bit that maybe they didn't understand or they'd want more information on. I hope that approach works. And I'm afraid I don't have a presentation, so got to look at me. In terms of the public response, the perceptual response to change, we had 189 Pathfinder plots operating this summer, where the verge was cut in late winter, early spring, and then not cut again until the end of the summer, and the arisings collected from site and taken away. Well, we started with 189. Over the course of the project, we lost probably around 80 of those from the project for various reasons. But significantly, some of those had to come out because of adverse public response to those, and it simply wasn't sustainable to keep them going. I had on each of the plots signage with an email address to request for people to request more information or to make comments or to, in many cases, get into conversation with me. Also publicised it through the free sheets, the council information sheets that come through. There was some stuff in local papers, and a number of groups shared information through social media, which helped as well to get some really valuable response. The response directed to the verge's email address was broadly supportive. Probably about 60 to 70% of respondents were in favour. They liked seeing the wildfire verge, or they liked the idea of it, and they wanted to see more of it. There was, as I said, some disagreement in numbers of individuals, much less, but in terms of persistence, much more. And there are a lot of officer capacity, not just mine, but colleagues in the highway service and other services dealing with the response. Unfortunately, to those, that was surprisingly significant effort required there. But overall, a lot of support for the Pathfinder plots when they were seen. Other uses of the highway became apparent, that it wasn't as simple as they're cut for highway asset management reasons, or they are not cut for biodiversity reasons. We discovered that there is a lot more activity on the verges through things such as the Britain in Bloom and the Village in Bloom schemes, that the verges had been integrated in a lot of these projects, sometimes formally, sometimes informally, and often not without the knowledge of the Highway Authority. And that the use of cultivation licenses, so that is where residents can adopt essentially the verge outside their home and take over the management of that verge. That is, we don't understand that sufficiently. How much of those are active, how many are inactive, and what is being done on those verges. So that's thrown up a whole new area of interest for us that we're going to need to look at. Overall, people were hoping to see that a great amount of savings would be made, because after all, if you tell people, well, we're going to say instead of cutting 6 times a year, we'd like you to cut once, then you're going to say, oh, God, at least 60% of your budget. We didn't find that. Through the Pathfinder project, we found that attendance on the verges, so the labour costs, were broadly the same, whether a plot was in a low cut regime or was in the high cut regime. And the reasons were that ground crews were going out to do framing cuts, edge cuts, for example. So that's where you've got tall vegetation that's flopping onto the road or onto the pavement and needs to be cut back to maintain access, or to reassure residents that their street hadn't been abandoned and that care was still being taken. Edging cuts helped a lot with that. We found that a lot of residents were concerned about litter and dog poo being more abundant on verges within the Pathfinder plots. Overall, we didn't find that there was more litter, but what we did find is that when it was deposited on the verge, it stayed on the verge because of the higher vegetation, didn't blow off down the street and into somebody's garden. And that required the ground crew to go out and collect litter. So usually what would happen in a 6 cut regime is they would pick up the litter and they would do the cut, but they were having to go out and respond to litter picking in addition to the cutting visits. The dog poo matter, we couldn't resolve one way or the other whether there was more or less. There was potentially a little bit of sort of observation bias, that these verges were looked at a lot more closely, and maybe, you know, we just don't see the mess in other areas because we're used to it. It's very hard to know. But certainly the litter one, we didn't feel that there was more litter being collected on these plots this year to previous years. The machinery costing and use of, that has been interesting. The machinery to cut and collect is reasonably expensive. Probably if both the tractor and the sit-on and the collection equipment is required to be purchased, that's going to be in the region of about £50,000 per district. We found that the available equipment didn't work in all places. So some verges were better than others. It certainly doesn't cope with slopes. It doesn't cope where there is a lot of obstruction in the verge. So planters, trees, other signage, such like that, furniture that would be in the verge. So that was a consideration that we needed to take into account when we were maintaining the verges that we selected, was whether or not the machinery could actually manage that. The key issue really taking this forward that has come from our research this year is what to do with the material that's collected. And I have spent a lot of time working with other councils who have perhaps some much more ahead than Derbyshire, but some slightly more ahead of us on what to do with the risings. And this is something that all of us are finding. When you cut the material from the verge, there are 3 options. One is that an area of the verge is a sacrificial area and the arisings are piled up against. Some people call it hedge banking or backing up against hedges when you've got wider verges in more rural locations. Another option is to have deposition areas where essentially old-fashioned compost piles can be left, where the grass cuttings can be rot down. And the third option is to take the cuttings back to depot and integrate it into the green waste collection services. All of those have disadvantages. We didn't find on any of the 189 verges that we put into the Pathfinder plot that any of them could accommodate the cuttings within the verge. That was either because they were too narrow or because they were in residential areas where that wasn't appropriate. We had concerns about fire risk, and we had concerns about all of the things that come with a big compost heap, as you can imagine, people concerning about rats or fire risk and such like. Because this was a time-limited one-summer scheme, we didn't ask the two Pathfinder councils to create new deposition areas on their own land, but we did have discussions about whether that would be possible. Again, came up with similar sort of problems. It would need to be away from people's houses. It would need to be in areas that are otherwise not precious, because the creation of these deposition piles would change the nutrient value of the soil in that area. And we're often, and if Holly, I don't know if Holly's still here, but I'm sure she'll be nodding her head if you say that, where people, what people call waste ground is usually the best areas for biodiversity and the last place we would want to put a large amounts of nutrient enrichment. So the option that the Pathfinder councils took was to integrate into the green waste collection service. And that had two disadvantages. One, you're driving the cuttings all around the district. Not brilliant when you're balanced against carbon matters. The other issue is the cost. So approximately, for one of our councils, approximately 1% of the verges that they manage on behalf of the Derbyshire County Council was put into the biodiversity plots, into the Pathfinder plots. And that 1% of additional green waste collection cost in excess of £5,000. If you scale that up even to 20–30% of each district, those costs are quite enormous. We talked to other councils. Suffolk, Oxfordshire have been very useful. Rotherham's been very useful. Couple in Wales who found similar problems. There are potential markets, but they're not really here yet, of anaerobic digestion systems that could use this, take this waste. There have been investigations on whether or not the creation of compost would be a sellable opportunity, but the business costs in that aren't really stacking up. Plus, the nature of the contaminants and pollutants that's coming off highway verges may make that prohibitive because of the risk of putting that into the food chain. So there's a lot of particulate matter that comes off road verges, as well as litter and dog mess. And there is the matter of exhaust contaminants as well. So all of these things are slightly tricky and unresolved at this point. But I think it gives us a much clearer perspective in responding to this, because as I'm sure you are all aware, that there's a great deal of public pressure to do something that's easy. Just do this. This is very easy. Just stop cutting. It's not as easy as that, but we're not at this point walking away from it. So the next steps for me is pulling this information together into a series of briefing notes for the relevant members and committees at my end at County Council. And we hope early in the next year to be working on a policy that potentially won't be the end of the story. Well, I hope won't be the end of the story. Where we can hope to find the capital expenditure that would be required to change to cut and collect systems, how we could make that possible, how we could make that accessible, routes to dealing with the deposition area, and some meantime ways where districts and boroughs such as yourselves, who are developing your local nature recovery strategies, can tap into that in some way. So whether that is looking at the guidance given to new developments, particularly new road developments, whether that's the public sector building those roads or whether that's in the private sector, and how we can respond to local need. And I think Gillian used that phrase, street by street response, that we do have a street by street response coming in where people are saying, well, I don't care what you're doing with the rest of the county, we in our street want to do it like this. And at the moment, the agency agreements are exceptionally restrictive and don't allow for that level of fine flexibility. So I think that might be a key starting point for us when we're trying to work out the big stuff, the finances, the deposition areas, that where we can look at building in flexibility within the agency agreement so that we are not throwing out potential good work that could happen now while we're waiting for the perfect in the future. Right, that was a really fast whiz. I hope it made some sense, and I'm really pleased to take questions and go back over things if people have those.
Okay, thanks, Susan.
Okay.
Any comments or questions?
I was worried when there's none that I've just talked rubbish.
No. Jean.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for that. I think it's the third time I've.
Yes, sorry, Jean, you've heard this all before so many times.
No, it's fine. And I think you enhanced it every time. I think it's very interesting that you've gone through all these different problems, because I know that AES, our company, has a lot of management problems over this kind of thing, and they yes. When does it actually go through DCC cabinet? Can you tell us that?
Well, the plan was that I was to, this month, December, be putting forward a high-level strategic overview with options for the members to pick, which would be locking us into a direction of travel, and that by April I would have a final and firm policy for them to adopt, which shouldn't be a surprise because they would have chosen the direction of travel in December. That has been postponed as a result of the big budget decisions that Derbyshire County Council is going to be making over the next month or two. It wasn't felt that we members could make a decision at this point, particularly as there would be a significant, in at least one of the options, there would be significant capital and revenue expenditure required to support that. Too much pressure to say, no, we're not going to do it, we can't afford it, when it would be better to come through with something that was perhaps a little bit more of a route map than make a decision now and stick to it, if that makes sense.
I noticed actually one of the, I don't know that you mentioned it this time, but it was about the actual 3-year time lapse that it takes to actually create a good biodiverse verge. And I think what was mentioned in Holly's plan for nature was slightly different, the way of doing it. So I don't know, I suppose.
Oh, was in terms of road verge management or in terms of grassland management as a whole?
Yeah, maybe is Holly still here?
I
Maybe
think
she
Holly's still here.
On that.
Yeah. Yep. Okay.
I think you said it was a 3-year plan where you cut the first year 3 times, the second year once.
We wouldn't specify quite to that detail, because you will have a number of verges that you can go in now and say, these are great. Look, the potential here is super, so you can drop straight onto a one cut this summer. What we found certainly with the urban verges is when you stop the cutting for the first year or two, is you get these very vigorous, very dominant species come up and they take over and they're huge and they obstruct visibility and people complain that they look awful, and then they flop over. And that for the first 1 to 2 years, you may want to cut more than once to really knock back those vigorous plants. And then after 2 to 3 years, you should see things starting to be more diverse, lower, sparser, and not requiring that hit. We would never put forward a single specification that all verges in all circumstances would need. Where you are in the high peak, as you get some elevation, you get potentially less of that unless you get a bracken infestation. But certainly in the urbans, as you get higher, don't tend to have that kind of big burst of really vigorous plants. But as you pull down the nutrients in the soil, those big vigorous ones are less successful. So it would be a case of, I hope, providing some guidance for grounds managers to say, you're going to need to keep an eye on things. But if you find by the end of June, everybody's going nuts because they've lost their children in the long grass, don't worry. You can do an extra cut on these ones, and you might need to do it next year, but by the third year, you'll probably be all right. It won't get as high as child height. I'm being slightly facetious, but
Yeah.
as it's an indication of it, it will be a process that reflects the conditions on the ground.
Yeah.
Holly, I don't know if that how much that is similar or differs to prescriptions that you might have added in the.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of going to come in, just second what you were saying. So, yeah, it's definitely never going to be like a one size fits all. So in the appendix, we've given sort of recommendations for appropriate measures for habitat management and creation, but they do have to be quite high level and an overview, and particularly with some of you much more urban verges, they are going to be much more difficult, and definitely not a one size fits all situation.
I think one of the things that was really nice about dovetailing into this report that Derbyshire Wildlife Trust have done for you, it is about skilling up the people who do the work, the people who are on the ground, and allowing them to make the appropriate decisions with the knowledge that the reports give and that are hopefully backed up from projects such as mine. And that's one of the things I found working with the Pathfinder project, is that the ground workers have been really keen to get involved with this and have felt appreciated in being able to make a decision that's appropriate. They actually know their areas really well, have been quite supportive of the project, and I've given them a lot of trust, and I think that trust has been repaid. So when I've had a grounds person phone me up saying, oh gosh, I've got this problem, and I say, well, what do you think would be the answer to it? And they said, I think we're going to have to cut this one. And I said, well, can we squeeze it another 2 weeks? They're going, yeah, we'll squeeze it 2 weeks. And it's worked. Others where they have wanted to push me to keep it longer, they're saying, no, I've been down to cut it, and I've seen all of these plants, and they've sent me a list back. No, the cornflowers are still out. I don't want to cut it. I said, well, it's fine. You make the call. So but that's because of the close contact that we've had, being able to share information, being able to say that there is nuance in this, and that we need to give you the skills to be able to make that call, and that's been really helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Jean. Joanna?
Yes, as I think Gillian said in the chat, verges are a big issue. I'm sure you know that. And we do get quite a lot of what you've described. It's simple. Why don't they do this? Why don't they listen to us from local groups? So I'm interested in the adopting a verge that you...
The cultivation license. The cultivation license is really onerous. So and it's something that is actually preventing a lot of groups getting involved in managing the verges.
Right.
So to get a cultivation license, an application is made to the Highways Authority. It's a legal document. When a cultivation license is issued, that is then taken out of the agency agreement control, and the person who owns the license has full responsibility for the management of that verge. That includes aspects of safety, and that includes them requiring them to have quite significant insurance to cover that. Now, it works quite well when you've got a householder that kind of just wants to extend their garden to the street and they want to plant a few bulbs. Great. But when it comes to this kind of scheme, it's difficult. It's also very piecemeal. So you'll have 3 houses doing cultivation license for wildlife, and then 1 house doing one for daffodils, and then the rest of the street under council management. So council comes along and cuts the bit they're supposed to cut, and the rest of the complete street, you haven't cut that bit. Well, that's a cultivation license. Or what's worse is the council comes along and cuts it all, and some of it's in a cultivation license.
So it sounds as if it isn't an answer for a piece of verge which might not even be anywhere near a house. to be managed by a local group for
It can be,
wildfires.
but it's really clunky, and I think we need to find a better way for when communities are working street by street. So one of the things we've done with the Pathfinders, and obviously this was temporary for the project, was that plots that were entered into the scheme, some were managed directly by the district and borough council grounds teams, some were managed by community groups, but we didn't require any of them to go into a cultivation license to do that. To just simplify the project, keep it appropriate. And they've all worked really well. So we've got communities who have managed excellent wildfire plots, and they've been really used as a sort of beacon, as an encouragement to extend the project, because it's kind of like, it can look like this, it can look this good. So I think the cultivation license were brought in, I think, in the Highways Act in 1950, and they really were concerned about horticultural stuff, you know, putting out a planter to make the front of your house look pretty. Doesn't really work for this kind of project.
Right, good, thank you. Well, not good, but thank you.
Yes, no, we need to find something better as the good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. Gillian.
Anthony, it's a question for you. Does High Peak Borough Council issue cultivation licenses on some of their verges? Oh, it's a question for Susan as well.
Yeah, it's a Highways Authority issue, so that's the county council. Yeah,
okay.
The districts and boroughs don't own any of the verges; they are all belong to the county council.
Right. Okay. So the roadside verges are.
Yes, on adopted highway.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, Jill. I don't see any further hands up. So thanks, Susan, for the update. Okay. I suspect it's one we'll come back to once things are a little clearer at county.
I hope so. I think what I'd like to do is to have a sort of draft set of documents, of guidance, of specifications out sometime early spring next year. So I'd really like some time to send that out to your staff on the ground. So I probably will come through. I don't know. I might come through you, Katie, or I might come through Gillian. I'm not sure. To have a look at those and discuss those and comment on those, and then that will be a great time to come back to you and say, well, this is where we're at this point. This is our route.
Yeah, no, that'd be great.
Lovely.
Okay, thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you for having me.
We shall move on again then to item 7 on the agenda, the nature declaration. Gillian.
Yeah, I just wanted to float this as an idea, really. So this is actually a cut and pastiche version of the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust, sorry, Holly, declaration that they're asking all the boroughs and districts in Staffordshire to sign up to, and we are looking to do that for moorlands. So it was whether it was something that this group feel that we should explore. I should have put sample, not draft, really, I guess, on it, because it isn't really a draft. Is the plan for nature enough, or could this sit with the plan for nature, as these are the sort of more minutiae targets or actions within it? So it was really for the group to have a think about whether it was something we wanted to pursue. I think Jean suggested it might become a motion for, you know, like the climate change emergency was, but we could launch it with the plan for nature potentially, because we've already done this. I don't know. Anyway, it was just to open up the discussion if people wanted to have a think about it, really. That was all.
Okay, any thoughts or comments? You don't necessarily have to come back right now. You can always send in any in between and we can come back to it at a later meeting. But there's 2 hands up now. So got Joanna and then Jill.
I think this is a really good idea, actually. I mean, I think this is a bit of a mess, to be honest, in the way it's written, but that doesn't matter. We can always look at it.
It is a cut and pastiche job.
Yeah. But I think that to have a, whatever you want to call it, nature recovery motion, biodiversity emergency, ecological emergency motion is a very good idea. I mean, partly because I think that, as we've said with climate change quite a lot, and as the Plan for Nature says, if this is supposed to be across the council, then all the members should at least have looked at it and voted on it, even if their levels of interest might vary. So a motion to full council seems to make sense to me.
Okay, thanks, Joanna. Jill?
Yeah, I agree with Joanna. I think it's a really good idea. I think if you pass it as a motion, but also have it as a declaration, it creates an accountability in the eyes of the public, and they understand it, and they'll see that, yes, High Peak Borough Council have, you know, they've passed this nature recovery declaration, and so it gives a kind of language. There's a narrative that we can kind of address. I think if we have this plan and an action plan, it doesn't mean the same. It doesn't carry the same urgency and the same dynamic. So I would say definitely.
Okay, thanks both. Any other comments or questions on this? No, we'll have a look a little further at how it could work. We'll also have a look and see, we've had previously work from sort of across Derbyshire through the Vision Derbyshire sort of climate change group. So we'll have a look to see if there's anything sort of similar, either coming through sort of Derbyshire Wildlife Trust or through that route from some of the other Derbyshire authorities, because it would sort of make sense if there's anything similar sort of coming in the works, that if we can sign up to it sort of as a county patch rather than just us as individuals. I think for some of it can help us sort of try and speed some bits of that along in terms of sort of implementing it. But we'll get some more details and we'll come back with a further update at a future meeting. Okay, there's no other bits on this. Move on then to our last item, which is just a verbal update around the annual report.
Yeah, so at the last meeting, I put a draft forward, and I haven't had the data through yet. I think people are sick and some are on holiday and things. So, but I still have it on my list. So what I've proposed to do is make the amends that you've all sent through, and I will email it around as soon as it's ready. So apologies, it's just not come to fruition as yet. So.
Okie doke. Any comments or questions from anyone? No, in that case then, can I thank you all for your virtual attendance this evening, and enjoy whatever else you're doing this evening. Night all.